This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
In 1973, the New York City Police Department created a hostage negotiation team.
He's not up against a gun. He's up against a man's mind.
When you're defusing a human bomb, it's the same as when you're taking apart a real bomb. If you skip a step, it's going to blow up right in your face.
Talk to Me tells the high-stakes true story of the world's first hostage negotiation team. It changed policing forever. Talk to Me.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors. 40 years ago, Ralph Stokes was convicted of killing multiple people at a restaurant where he once worked. But did he do it? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my phenomenal co-host, Alice.
Phenomenal. That's very nice of you. I feel less than phenomenal today. I'm just like, I don't know.
Oh.
I'm just coming down, still coming off the holidays, I think.
Yeah, it's tough. By the time people hear this, it'll be like February.
I know.
For us, it's still early in the year.
It's early in the year. February, I might still feel blah. I don't know. January always catches me off.
Alice is cool, so she was out partying all night on New Year's Eve. Or I was just laying on the couch watching football. So
I partied until 11 p.m., and I was demolished the next day.
Yeah, we're not as young as we used to be, Alice, but
apparently
not as old as we could be. So.
Anyways, it's so good to be back with you recording, and especially with this incredibly interesting case today. I don't know. I really like looking at convictions from decades ago to kind of compare how our system has evolved, how some things are just kind of constant throughout the ages.
Yeah, it's crazy to read transcripts from cases that are 40 years old or whatever, because this one was a doozy. There were a lot of things that happened in this case that aren't necessarily anything related to the outcome or anything like that, but just the style of the lawyers, the style of the judge, the things that people would say. It was really interesting. I don't know. It's a complete aside, but I agree with you, Alice. I like to look at these old cases too. And this one's, hey, this is an interesting case. I think you guys are going to like it. Basically, as y'all know, we like to look at these cases where people claim that someone's innocent who's in prison, and sometimes people like to say that we think everybody's guilty. That is not true, though. I want everybody to get close to the radio real quick, because I have something to tell you. They usually are guilty. But that doesn't mean they always are, and we have pointed to cases where we thought people either the courts didn't do a job of reaching reasonable doubt. I think Michael Peterson's a good example of that. I'm still a little up in the air about whether the owl did it whether he did it or whether it was some sort of freak accident. But I think one thing I feel pretty confident about, he wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty. So I thought the jury got that one wrong. And the Ramsey case, there was never a trial in that case, but a lot of people thought that the Ramsey family was responsible for the death of John Bonet, and we did not come to that conclusion. And then, of course, Temujin Kinsu, which I like to mention as much as possible because that one, it's crazy. The Temujin Kinsu case, the thing that's wild about that, the longer you do this stuff and the longer you stay online, the more you run into people who are very firmly in the camp of either everybody's innocent or everybody's guilty. And there's a lot of people who are, pretty much everybody's guilty. They think most of the sort of the innocent projects are frauds, and they get guilty people out of jail all the time. The crazy thing about Temujin Kinsu, everybody agrees he's innocent. Even the people who think everybody's guilty think he's innocent. And it just blows my mind in that case because it's continuing to go on. But anyways, we like to look at these cases, and what's great is we have the best resource for this in the world, our friend Maggie Freeling, who does this basically for a living. She's now the co-host of the Wrongful Conviction podcast. Really great. She also did Unjust and Unsolved. Check it all out. It's amazing. And every now and then I'll reach out to her and say, hey, do you have a case? Is there a case we should really look at? Because the thing about Maggie is, unlike a lot of people, she doesn't just do the famous cases. In fact, she hardly ever does the famous cases. She's doing cases that aren't famous, that are less well known. This is one of them. I don't know that anybody other than Maggie has ever covered this case. If somebody has, props to you. But Maggie covered this case on her Unjust and Unsolved series, and we listened to that episode, and we thought, this is one we want to look at, and here we are, Alice.
Indeed. And really, we've talked about our love for Maggie many times before. We really respect the work she does, and especially love how she shares her resources freely, because what she's trying to get at is the truth. If someone's unjustly, wrongfully convicted, she wants to be able to have that information out there and have as many smart people look at it as possible. So, as always, go listen to her. We respect her greatly as a journalist and a podcaster. And let's dive in. Let's talk about Ralph Stokes.
Before we dive in,
okay.
I have something else I want to say. Alice is 100% right, and Maggie sent us all the transcripts from this case, which was great because it's a very old case, so getting information on it would be really hard, and so we were able to look at all that. Really appreciate that, and so thank you to Maggie. One thing I want to say before we get started, and we talked about this a little bit in the Katie Autry case, and that's sort of the nature of wrongful convictions. And one thing that I think is important to remember as we talk about this, there are two things actually I want to say. The first is I want everybody to reserve judgment until the end of this case. And I know that's hard. I learned about something recently that I knew sort of conceptually existed, but I didn't know it had a name, and that's called anchoring bias, which apparently the earliest information you hear about something tends to be the information that you're going to believe, and you become anchored to that, and it's very hard to get off of it. We've talked about this before, that the order in which we present cases is sometimes difficult because we don't want to bias people with one view or another until it's all said and done. This, I think, is a really important case for everybody to keep an open mind, because I will tell you, when we start this case, you are going to come to one conclusion. You are going to believe something. I'm not going to tell you what, but you're going to believe that Ralph is either guilty or he's not guilty. You're going to believe one of those things. And you're going to believe one of them, because when you initially look at this case, you really are pulled to a certain conclusion. But I promise you, once we look deeper into it, you're going to be shaken in your faith about that. So keep an open mind. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think a lot of times when we talk about these wrongful conviction type cases, there is a tendency to think that the accused is an angel and the police and the prosecutors are devils and they're evil and everything they do is evil, and it's because they just want to put innocent people in prison. And it's just completely wrong. I don't actually think it's helpful. In fact, I think it's probably harmful for people who care about Innocence Project type stuff to come into things with that kind of view. So let's also not do that here. We're going to talk about that more when we talk about the prosecutor in this case. But I think sort of my overarching theme for this introduction is keep an open mind. We're going to do a couple episodes on this, and I promise you by the end, you are going to be confused. I'll say that. You will be confused. Wherever you start off, you'll be confused by the end.
Okay, you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Those are all really good points to remember, Brett. And we're only giving those qualifiers here because this is such an intellectually interesting case. And of course, it matters for Ralph Stokes, and the people who have a role in this entire episode. So it matters on a personal level, but it also matters as an intellectual level and how you think about all cases. So this is just a reminder, in case you're joining us for the first time, of what we do, which is we try to cut down to just the straight facts and give you the facts so that you can think for yourself and you can do your own logical reasoning for yourself, which will serve you well in many areas of life. So with that said, it was noon on March 11th, 1982, when two masked men walked into Smokin' Joe's Corner restaurant in Philadelphia and ordered the workers into a meat locker. They were there to rob the place, but things went wrong. Shots rang out, and two of the workers and a postman who had the bad luck of showing up at the wrong time were shot. Now, two of the workers survived when the shooter's gun jammed and the robbers ran, but the living witnesses believed they knew one of them, and that was Ralph Trent Stokes, a man who had worked at the restaurant before. Stokes and an accomplice were arrested, and the accomplice, Donald Jackson, fingered Stokes as the shooter. Stokes was convicted and sentenced to death. But now, 40 years later, some question whether Stokes is actually an innocent man.
And this is probably one of the oldest cases we've looked at where it's sort of still an ongoing thing. You have somebody who's been convicted, they're claiming they're innocent. March 11th, 1982. I mean, we're going on 41 years.
I'm just going to say this happened before I was born.
I was about to say that, so I'm glad that you went ahead and said it.
I went ahead and said it.
This happened before Alice was born, and I was a mere 6 months old or something when this happened. A little older than that. But, so yeah, I mean, this was a long time ago. And Ralph Stokes, he's sometimes called Trent. I think he went by Trent a little bit back then. He goes by Ralph now. He spent that entire time in prison and is on death row. It's in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania doesn't often execute people, though they do on occasion. So whether or not he's really in danger of ever being executed might be up in the air, but he's certainly in prison for the rest of his life with no chance of ever getting out, and he has maintained his innocence this entire time, even after a trial in which he was found guilty. Those of you who know, Smokin' Joe's was partially owned by Joe Frazier, who's a famous boxer. He was actually the first boxer to defeat Muhammad Ali, one of the greatest of all time. And after he retired, like a lot of people, he lends his name to a place like this and gets a cut of the profits. But it wasn't like Smokin' Joe was, down at the restaurant when the robbery happened or anything like that. But this was sort of a place that was well known in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia in particular. So this was shocking. This was shocking when this happened. Obviously a brutal crime. 3 people shot and killed. 2 of them who were working there, and one guy who's he's just delivering the mail. And we'll talk about his case as well. And really brutal for the survivors. To this day, the husband of one of the victims is still agonized over this. Still talks about how he's still waiting for justice. He doesn't understand why Ralph Stokes, 40 years later, is still sitting on death row and hasn't been executed. And a painful day. And one that feels like sort of a straightforward case. Got a robbery. People who work there, they recognize one of the guys. This should be open and shut, right? And for a lot of people, it was. But as we walk through it, I think you'll see why we decided to go ahead and cover this case. Let's take a look at the timeline. It's not a very long timeline. This is not really a timeline case, but we always do a timeline, and we wanted to do one today. So this is March 11th, 1982. It's about 11:30 a.m. in the morning. Workers are starting to show up to prep the restaurant for opening. Now, that isn't until 3 o'clock. It was not open for lunch. The restaurant was never open for lunch. And so there were very few people who were present at the restaurant at the time. This becomes very important for the prosecution. This is something they point to a lot because their theory, or one of their theories, is this had to have been an inside job because of some of the information that the people who committed the robbery knew. And one of the pieces of information they knew was that this restaurant wasn't open for lunch. I did not find this particularly compelling. I understand that at the time there was no Google, so you couldn't look up when a place was open. But I also feel like if you were going to rob a place, you might have swung by and kind of cased out the joint a couple times just to see when it was open, or at least, check the times on the door to see when it was open. So I wasn't overwhelmed by this information, but it is something the prosecution sort of goes back to again and again. And one of the things they do is when they're talking to the various witnesses who are going to implicate Ralph, they'll ask him things like, did you ever go to Smoking Joe's? Have you ever eaten there? Have you ever stepped foot inside? Do you even ever get down to that side of town? And all of them in their testimony would say no. And that, of course, was sort of bolster this idea that the only person involved in this who really would have had that information would have been Ralph. And choosing to rob the place at that time was smart. You obviously don't want to rob a restaurant when it's full of patrons. Harder to control, a lot more witnesses. You want to go in there when there's a couple people there who can give you the money and you can get out the door.
And one thing to note, this is a restaurant, and like Brett had said, it's a pretty well-known restaurant. Even if you had not cased out a place in advance, as you're walking up to it, if the place were open and bustling, let's say every table was filled, you might rethink whether that's the best time to rob it, even if you hadn't previously cased it out. So that's just something to keep in mind where, a restaurant usually has open windows, you can see in. You don't usually have to step in to see, the capacity or whether it's filled or not. So I agree with Brett that, that line of questioning may or may not be very compelling, but just think about kind of the setup of a restaurant. Usually walking by, whether you go in or not, you can tell how many people are there.
And I'll say this, this may seem trivial, but I actually think it's kind of important. Number one, as Alice said, you would notice whether there are people there. And in fact, Donald Jackson, who is the co-defendant who openly admits he was one of the people who was there, says that they actually parked outside the restaurant for a little while because there was a cop sitting in his police car nearby. So they obviously weren't going to rob the restaurant while the cop was there. So even if this was sort of we'll go down there and see what's going on, and if it looks like we can rob it, we'll rob it, they would have had time to see exactly what Alice is seeing, which is there's nobody in the restaurant, there's nobody going in the restaurant. Obviously it's closed. You can tell when a place is closed when you're sitting outside of it. So maybe not as important. Why are we talking about all this? Because it is a piece of evidence that the prosecution is relying on, this inside job aspect. And the fact that Ralph had worked there before was important to them because that was sort of he was the mastermind. He was the one who said, hey, we can rob this place and I know exactly how to do it because I know when it's open. I know where they keep the money, all that sort of stuff. And that becomes important because if it seems like one of the robbers knows that information, it will lead you to believe it is an inside job. And a lot of robberies are inside jobs. And it's something you always have to consider and you always have to think about because, robbers are like everybody else. They're risk averse. If they're going to rob a place, they want to know they're going to get away with some money. So they tend to rob places that either they know there's going to be a lot of cash. It's one reason you see like convenience stores were often robbed, or liquor stores back in the day before everybody had credit cards, because they knew they would just have a lot of cash. So you rob the place, you get the quick cash and get out. Same thing here. You wouldn't necessarily know whether a restaurant would have a lot of money, but the robbers, they knew it was closed and they knew about a safe. I want to talk about that in a second. So around noon, at least two men, I'm saying at least two men because there's some speculation that there might have been three, in ski masks and ski suits come in with guns. So they're wearing ski masks, which I assume everybody knows, but those are the masks that go all the way down over your face, cover basically your entire head, and then there's some holes cut out for the eyes and a hole cut out for the mouth and maybe for the nose. And then they've got these like ski suits. And I say ski suits, but I don't know that it's necessarily what you see on the slopes in Vail. They just have sort of full body suits, right, that would kind of go jumpsuits, essentially, that would go, they cover their whole body. It's Philadelphia, snows a lot of people have that stuff. These are good things because the more you can cover up of yourself, the harder it is for someone to recognize you. So they got these masks on, they got the suits on, and they've got guns. They order some of the workers into a freezer. They sort of lock them in the freezer, but they take one of the workers, Mary Figueroa, into the office to open the safe. This was another indication that somebody involved in this had some inside information. Mary was the manager. Mary would have been able to open the safe. They knew the safe was in the office. This wasn't a thing where they came in and they said, "Where's the money?" And Mary said, "It's in a safe in the office." They came in, they put the dishwasher and the cook in the freezer. And then they told the office manager, let's go to the office where the safe is. You're going to open it and give us the money. So they take her back there.
So 2 points of knowledge about this place. Not only the location of the safe, but the person who would have the authority to open the safe, so there wasn't kind of bungling around of, no, they have it. No, they have it. There's a key over there. So this is interesting because the less time you give basically the victims time to talk to each other and bungle it, the less time the police have to kind of track down what's happening and thwart your plan.
So shortly after this happens, and we're not going to go into detail about this in the timeline because it is kind of confused about the order of things, but we'll just give you the general idea of what goes down here. And then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what different witnesses said about exactly what happened and when it happened after this. After this, Mary gets put back in the freezer. When she goes in the freezer, she's sort of distraught, and she says something to one of the people in the freezer. What exactly she said, as we're going to note, is confusing, but it is often reported as she says, that was Ralph, or that was Trent, is actually because they knew him as Trent. She says something along the lines of, one of them is Trent. I can't believe it. I can't believe he would do something like this. Meanwhile, at least according to sort of the prosecution theory, Trent's figured out that she knows who he is. And so at some point he decides, got to kill everybody. They know who I am, got to kill everybody. At some point, and it's a little confusing about the order here, he goes back into the freezer, he shoots Mary, he shoots one of the other people. He may have taken a shot at the other two, but the gun jams. But at around the same time, you have this postal carrier who's stopping by to drop off mail. And he gets brought inside, and at some point, he's shot. So he's shot as well. It's a little weird because you have this whole gun jamming issue, and yet you have two groups of people who seem to be shot at different times. We'll get into that later. But whatever the case, there are 3 people now who are dead. There are 2 more people who are in the freezer. Everybody's freaking out. Trent is, his gun's jammed or whatever. And Donald Jackson's like, I'm getting out of here. So he runs out. He jumps in his car. Trent's following him. He jumps in his car. They speed off. At around 12:30, so not much longer after that, the co-owner of the restaurant and Mary's husband, George Figueroa, he shows up at the restaurant and he finds this absolute massacre. His wife and 2 others are dead. The 2 other co-workers are freaking out. They're huddled in the freezer. They're terrified. They call the police. At 1:26, the first officer arrives on the scene.
Why did it take so long?
Yeah, the times here are weird, right? So, it's reported that it was around 12:30 when George shows up. I think it probably was a little later. And this is something that happens in basically every case, where people are asked what time something happened, and they're always wrong about it. Always. Unless they have a very specific reason, they're always wrong about it. So this happens. It takes a little while to sort out. They call 911. The 911 call we'll talk about later. Everybody's very unhelpful in the 911 call. But we know for a fact that the police officer's there by 1:26. So they're dealing with the scene. They're cleaning up. So now, according to the prosecution theory, Donald Jackson and Trent, Ralph, Stokes, whatever you want to call him, they go to a friend's house, they divvy up the money, and around 4 p.m., they go together to a barbershop to get their hair cut. This is obviously also important for the prosecution because it puts Ralph and Donald Jackson together on the day of the murders and the robbery. It does not take long for the police to identify who they're going to go after here. As we said, Mary seems to have fingered Trent for the crime before she was shot. So based on that information, the police, they're getting a search warrant. They execute it on Ralph's home where he is staying with his parents. They find a few things that are interesting to them. They find spent bullet casings that are similar to the kind of bullets used in the robbery. So they're the same caliber and all that stuff. It's impossible for them to link them up directly, but it's the same caliber, same type of bullet. But all they find is the casings. So they don't find the bullet itself, just the casings. They also find gloves with the trigger finger cut out. I don't really know why you do this, actually. I guess it may be
to feel the trigger better.
That way you don't accidentally shoot you don't actually shoot the gun. Because usually you wear gloves to avoid touching the weapon. I guess it's very unlikely to leave a usable print on a trigger. So maybe this is actually a pretty good idea. In any event, they find this, and this is similar to the gloves that the survivors describe as being worn by the shooter. They also find a blue jumpsuit that sort of matches what was described. We talked about this, the ski suit they were wearing. The jumpsuit is like blue with red trim, and there's no red trim described by the survivors, but obviously people don't get all the details right. It's close enough for the police. And soon thereafter, they will arrest Trent. Donald Jackson, by this point, is on the run. They will arrest him as well. And after Jackson gives a full confession, they very much focus on Trent as he's the guy, he's the main guy, and we're going to use Donald Jackson to convict him and put him in prison and on death row for murdering these people.
So that's the timeline, which actually it's not very long. You know, the robbery happens kind of within the span of an hour. And then by the next morning, they're already honing in on who they believe to be the shooter, the killer. And that would be Trent or Ralph. And so we have the entire timeline there, which we've already mentioned is not that much. You have, you know, two survivors who have just been through a lot of trauma, have seen their friends and coworkers and a random, you know, postman be shot in just absolute, you know, tragedy in front of them, and they are doing their best to piece together what happened in a short amount of time.
And you have a lot of things coming together that would make you think this is an open and shut case. So you basically have one of the victims identify one of the shooters. You execute a search warrant, you find some evidence that, while you can't directly tie it to the crime, is good circumstantial evidence. We've talked about circumstantial cases before, building those cases. These are the kind of things where they're little pieces of evidence where individually maybe they don't mean much, but when you put them together, it paints a pretty good picture. And in some ways, this is one of the reasons that I thought it was good to do this case. Well, it's an interesting case from this perspective of wrongful conviction. In some ways, it sets up perfectly to maybe have something like that, because very quickly, the police would have decided, we've got our guy. All these things are pointing towards it being this person. And it may make them overlook or not consider some other evidence to the contrary later on. And as I said at the beginning, when you're thinking about wrongful convictions, if you want to believe that there are prosecutors and police officers out there deciding to frame someone for really no apparent reason, manufacturing evidence, planning evidence in order to build that case, feel free to think that. In reality, when you have wrongful convictions, probably what they look like much more is the police are on to someone early on and have reason to think they're involved, and that leads them to both tunnel vision and maybe to ignore evidence to the contrary, maybe hide evidence to the contrary. I'm not going to say that doesn't happen, because it absolutely does. And that's the kind of thing. They get down this track and they just can't imagine the person being innocent. And so they want to do whatever it takes to put this guilty person in prison.
Maybe anchoring bias, in fact.
There you go. Exactly, Alice. Anchoring bias. Good. Wow. Good
callback.
See, this is why Alice is the best.
And again, what we said about anchoring bias earlier is that you don't mean to do it. It's just a psychological, the world is chaos, right? And our brains are always trying to create order out of chaos. And anchoring bias is one way to do that. It's not always wrong. In fact, the reason our brains go to it is oftentimes the kind of like Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a type of anchoring bias, right? Like what's most likely, maybe what is presented first. And that's why your brain grasps onto the most obvious, reasonable answer. And so we're saying that not to say that there could be any wrongdoing, but our brains are just trying to make sense of chaos at all times. And everyone is subject to that, including investigators and police.
And look, Occam's razor is great. It's a great tool to use in life because we have limited time and limited resources and limited information. And you're often having to make decisions with those three things. And so having a tool that helps you sort of remove a bunch of extraneous possibilities and really kind of drill down to what's most likely, that's great. It does not always lead you to the right answer. Just because it's the simplest answer does not mean it's correct. It means it's most likely to be correct. And even if that's true, what's your error rate there for Occam's razor? I mean, who knows, right? But there is one. And so you have to be careful not to be so focused on that. And I think you see that in a lot of sort of interesting places where people are so focused on Occam's razor that they really do ignore contrary evidence. I mean, Dyatlov Pass might be an example of that. You know, don't want to go down that rabbit hole again, but I'm just saying there are cases where there are things that should make you pause that a lot of people just ignore because, well, that would mean it's not the simplest answer, and obviously the simplest answer is going to be right. So let's talk about the case in more detail, and we cannot talk about this case and really even start talking about this case without talking about Roger King. Now, Roger King is someone that some of you will be familiar with, either because you live in Philadelphia or maybe because you're in sort of the Innocence community. King was a legendary and incredibly controversial district attorney in Philadelphia, and he is the person who prosecuted Ralph's case. Give you a little background on Roger King, because I think it's interesting to sort of know how he thinks. A lot of times he will just be presented as a monster. I mean, he's a monster. He just put people in prison all the time who are innocent, bad guy or whatever. But in reality, I think when you look at Roger King, what you see is someone who was really committed to prosecuting crime and maybe allowed that to cloud his judgment at times, and this might have been one of those cases. He was born in 1944 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he was the son of a preacher. And if you've ever heard him or seen him either in action or talking to the media, you can see his father's influence on his sort of evangelic style that he uses in the courtroom. It's kind of crazy because I would not think that style would be as successful in Philadelphia as it is. But I mean, it's as if he is standing in front of a pulpit. He is preaching to that jury. In this case, in a lot of cases, he's quoting Bible verses, kind of things that, frankly, you just can't do now. But he would do it, and he was very successful. It really worked for him, and it was very convincing to the juries that he was in front of. He was actually an excellent football player. And you might think, well, being an excellent football player in Tuscaloosa, obviously he's going to end up at Alabama or Auburn or somewhere like that. But remember one time we're talking about here, he is a black man in the segregated South. There are no opportunities for him. So he actually ends up going to USC and plays safety. After he graduates, he then goes from USC to the rival, UCLA, for law school. So already somebody who you can see, I mean, this guy is driven, he's smart, he's talented, and he is committed to sort of building this life for him. And he's not really worried about the obstacles that are going to be in front of him. Frankly, he's somebody that, were it not for some of the things we're going to talk about, would be really celebrated as a pioneer. But he's going to do some things that are going to taint that legacy.
The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey, listeners, whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance, too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance. Then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options.
Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the new Name Your Price tool for yourself. And join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Most of you have probably heard me sing the praises of Prose, the world's most personalized hair care. Switching to a custom routine from Prose was one of the best things I've done for my hair, and the results I'm seeing just keep getting better. You guys know we always talk about how busy we are with kids, full-time jobs, these podcasts. I really don't have time to make my hair look good, but now with Prose, all I have to do is wash with the custom shampoo and conditioner that they have created for me and my hair has gotten so much stronger and shinier. Prose knows there's more to you than just your hair type. Prose has given over 1 million consultations with their in-depth hair quiz, which is how I got started. It's super easy. Just click through some questions. You'll be surprised at everything they factor in, like your zip code and your eating habits and even your exercise level. Don't lie about that.
Yeah, Alice, my wife has beautiful curly red hair, but sometimes it's hard for her to find the perfect hair products, but not with Prose. Because Prose analyzes over 85 personal factors and hand-picks clean ingredients that can get you closer to your hair goals with every wash. I know my wife's favorite feature is Prose Review and Refine tool, which lets her tweak her formulas for any reason in case she changes up her address, her hair color, or even her diet. Or like you said, sometimes you work out more, sometimes you work out less. If you're not 100% positive Prose is the best hair care for you, they will take the products back, no questions asked. Prose is the healthy hair regimen with your name all over it. Take your free in-depth hair consultation and get 15% off your first order today. Go to prose.com/prosecute. That's prose.com/prosecute. Prose.com/prosecute for your free in-depth hair consultation and 15% off. Alice, we're back with one of my absolute favorite sponsors, HelloFresh. Literally just today, my wife and I, we dropped the kids off at daycare. We were walking back and we were like, oh my goodness, what are we going to make tonight? And then my wife said, HelloFresh is coming today. And sure enough, that's what we had. We had the awesome pork bibimbap. It was tremendous. As you know, I'm back on keto, and it was easy for us to make our HelloFresh meal into the perfect keto dinner. You guys can do it too. With HelloFresh, eating well in the new year can be stress-free and delicious. With over 35 weekly recipes, they have the options you're looking for to help you achieve your goals. You can choose Calorie Smart and Carb Smart recipes, or even customize select meals by swapping proteins or sides, upgrading your proteins, or adding protein to a veggie dish.
And Brett, it makes just eating healthy and cooking healthy for my family so easy. I can skip the schlep to the grocery store, and I can stock up on snacks, sides, desserts, and more at HelloFresh Market. You simply add these staples and sweets to your weekly order, and they'll arrive at your doorstep along with your meals. It's really a one-stop shop. So go to HelloFresh.com/TP21 and use code TP21 for 21 free meals plus free shipping. That's HelloFresh.com/TP21 and use code TP21 for 21 free meals plus free shipping. And find out for yourself why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit.
Alice, here's something you might never have thought about. Why does laundry detergent come in massive plastic jugs? Who wants that? Those inconvenient, awkward, heavy jugs are filled with messy goo, which gets everywhere, and it's up to 90% water. Washing machines already use water, so why should we pay more for it? Not to mention, 91% of those jugs don't get recycled. That's right, 700 million detergent jugs wind up in our landfills every single year. But it's not like you can just stop doing laundry. So do what we did, switch to Earth Breeze. Earth Breeze laundry detergent eco sheets look like dryer sheets, but they're not. They dissolve 100% in any wash cycle, hot or cold. It couldn't be easier. No measuring or mess, just toss them in.
Brett, I am loving these Earth Breeze sheets because I do laundry, I think, multiple times a day with so many kids who just spill food on their clothes all the time. And just grabbing one of these eco sheets, folding them, putting them into my washing machine makes it easier. I don't have to lift heavy jugs of detergent. And I also know I'm doing something good for the environment. I'm telling you, you won't really know it until you try it. But if you don't like it, Earth Breeze will give you a full refund. You don't even have to send it back. They're confident you'll love it as much as I do. Now's the time to try Earth Breeze because right now our listeners can subscribe and save 40%. Go to earthbreeze.com/prosecutors to get started. That's earthbreeze.com/prosecutors for 40% off. earthbreeze.com/prosecutors.
I was going to say he really is someone who has overcome a lot, born in the 40s and doesn't let these things hold him back. And it's kind of amazing to see his rise to success. He just keeps succeeding in his early years, which is why he's so winsome in the courtroom as well. I mean, he is straight out of like a storybook attorney. One who walks in and you can probably imagine his amazing storytelling ability and the command he has that's like an evangelical preacher.
And that's exactly right. I mean, he is that. If you have the opportunity to try and look up some of his stuff, it's worth listening to. I'm not going to say that you're going to like all of it, and some of it you may be shocked happens in a courtroom. But once again, as Alan said, this is 40 years ago. Things are a little different. But he was really good at what he did. He graduates from law school. And, this is one of those things where he probably could have done a lot of things. Being a football player at USC and then graduating from UCLA with a law school degree, I got to imagine there's a lot of people in California who would have loved to employ him.
He could have been a sports agent, a businessman. I mean, really, he has a big personality. He could probably sell anything, including cases, which is what he ultimately did.
But he decides against, making a ton of money or being a sports agent, living life out on the coast. Instead, he ends up moving to Philadelphia. He joins the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office in 1973. And just 3 years later, he becomes part of the elite homicide unit and was one of the youngest people to ever take part in that prestigious work. And this was quite an accomplishment for a young African-American lawyer, even in Philadelphia. We've talked about this before. Sometimes people in the modern world, they sort of imagine that there was a bunch of racism in the South and then the rest of the country, everything was great and hunky-dory, and that just wasn't true. And a lot of people, if you guys know anything about Philadelphia history, you know the sort of tortured history of race in Philadelphia and how there was a lot of racism in Philadelphia, particularly in the 60s and 70s. We're going to do a couple cases on that later on because there's this one event in Philadelphia history which is so insane. I don't want to get off on it right now, but it's so insane that we're going to do some episodes on it, and it sort of relates to the sort of racial tension. So the fact that he's able to do that, he's overcoming once again the same sort of discrimination. Even if it's not discrimination, it's prejudice, right? Just a thought that, look, it's great that you're here, enjoy prosecuting parking tickets. The fact that he's able to so quickly move into the homicide unit says something about him, and he very quickly becomes a revered figure in the Black legal community, and he sees himself as a protector of the Black community, and he was particularly aggressive against defendants he believed put that community at risk. This is really fascinating because usually when you think about these sort of wrongful convictions, rogue prosecutors, there usually is a racial element. People think there's some racism going on here. I mean, think of the Curtis Flowers case in Mississippi. People think there's a racial element going on here and that's influencing what's happening. And for him, it was, I guess there was a racial element in one way, in that he saw himself as, I must protect this community. There's so much violence in this community. I want to put these people in prison who are causing problems in this community. And because of that, you can imagine that some tunnel vision is going to develop in the same way that tunnel vision might develop for a prosecutor who does have some sort of racial bias. For him, it's a different kind of tunnel vision, but it's one that certainly plays a part in his story. And he is very successful. By the time he retires, he's secured 16 death penalty convictions, more than anyone in Pennsylvania history, with hundreds of more convictions for murder and other serious crimes to his name. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone loved him. In fact, it was said that he received 4 or 5 death threats every week that he was a prosecutor.
And you can imagine why. He is clearly this charismatic, smart African-American man who is just breaking barriers in Philadelphia and putting a lot of people who've been accused of heinous crimes on death row, the ultimate punishment that our justice system provides. And so that's a lot of death threats a week, Brett. I don't think we're important enough for people to give us that many death threats, but it kind of gives you an idea of what he's facing, right? He continued to kind of pursue justice in his mind, his career, despite facing a lot of opposition. This is to give you an idea of how people view him and also the environment that he was operating within.
But there's also a dark side to King's legacy that we've already alluded to. No fewer than 7 of his murder convictions have been overturned due to allegations that he made improper statements in court, that he hid exculpatory evidence, and he intimidated witnesses into changing their stories with threats or promises of undisclosed benefits. Obviously, if you've been with us for a while and listened to the rules of evidence, those are no-nos. You can't hide exculpatory evidence. You have to turn over Brady evidence, exculpatory information. You can't, force or coach witnesses to say certain things. But you've also kind of heard about the personality of who King is like larger than life personality.
And let me say this. I think some of it is that. It's the personality. I think some of this is, particularly with the witnesses, that King just was so overbearing that if he was prepping you and you said something he didn't like, he was pretty good at getting you to where he wanted you to be. And there is a fine line here. And I think it's something that's important to remember. There's a fine line with all this stuff. Everything is always presented as black and white. Whenever you see cases like this, whenever you see complaints about a prosecutor, it's always presented as black and white. Well, he intimidated witnesses and he hid evidence that he should have turned over. Brady is actually pretty complicated. As we've said before, it is not you must turn over everything. That is not what it says. It's you only have to turn it over if it's exculpatory, credible evidence, and that's the only time you have to turn it over. And if it's not that, if you judge that that's not the case, then you can withhold it. Deciding to withhold it is putting a bomb in your own case. So a lot of times, the best case is just to turn it over. But that wasn't his position. And the intimidating witnesses thing, once again, what is intimidating a witness? I'll give you an example. A witness comes in and he lies to you. And you know he's lying to you. And you say to him, you know that it is a crime for you to lie to me. And he says, okay, fine, I'll tell you the truth. Did you just intimidate him? Because some people would call that, if they were writing an article on how you intimidated a witness, they would say he threatened to put that person in prison unless he said what he wanted him to say. That's how they would spin that. And that's a little different from an actual threat. Like, well, I'm going to put your family in prison unless you say exactly what I want you to say. That's an actual threat. Obviously, it's not usually that direct, and that's why this is complicated. But nevertheless, that's the fine line you're looking at. The undisclosed benefits thing is a problem because you can give benefits to people. You can decide not to prosecute somebody for their testimony, but you have to turn it over to the defense because they have to be able to use that to question their credibility on cross-examination. And so that is an issue, and all of this may be an issue, but they are the kind of things that he is routinely accused of.
That's a really good point because it's easy to kind of shade it and call it, intimidation, but there's a lot of nuance in this, especially when you are talking to witnesses. And we've talked about this. We've yet to talk to a single witness, innocent or accused of a crime, who hasn't shaded the truth in some way. And part of our job as prosecutors, investigators, is to get to the truth. And sometimes that includes some sort of kind of vigorous questioning that could be viewed in some light as putting on pressure or, call it something uglier than that. So though you may hear, one thing of characterizing how King may have spoken to witnesses, also recognize that it could be a little bit more nuanced than that. Another thing that King did that was controversial is he used jailhouse informants in most of his cases. And in a surprisingly high number, the same informant who was so good at getting confessions, we have spoken about jailhouse informants as well. Now, remember, this is 40 years ago, so we have more information today about the reliability of jailhouse informants than, say, 40 years ago. But you gotta think, if you're using the same witness over and over and over, how is that person such a confidant to all of these, dangerous criminals who just spill their guts and their confessions to this person? That can be viewed, obviously, with, some skepticism if the same person keeps coming forward with confessions. But that is what happened in this case, and there was one guy in particular that King used a lot.
And I know of at least one example of a similar thing to this where the guy was a fraudster, really just world-class fraudster, and he had defrauded a whole bunch of people, and he had lived the high life. He was driving around Maseratis and all this stuff. He got arrested, he goes to prison, and he becomes this great informant. And what he would do, and what the police and the prosecutors would do, is whenever they wanted someone to confess like this, they would put them in the cell with him. They would become cellmates. And this guy was so good at basically, manipulating people that he would manipulate these people into admitting whatever they did. And the police had basically bugged his cell. So they recorded all this. So it's 100% true that everybody who went in there, they said the things that he was saying they were saying. This is not an instance of him making it up. And the police would have it on tape, and then they would use it. Now, is it possible he sort of coerced them into doing that? I don't know. But he would get basically time off what had essentially been a life sentence for this massive fraud every time he did this, until eventually I think he was released. He managed to get released from prison because he got so many guys to admit what they did, including one sort of pretty serious murder case. He was able to get the guy to confess basically everything he had done and to tell him things that only the killer would know. When you read this, it seems shady right from the get-go, but I do know of this tactic being used at least once with someone else.
And one really interesting thing about this is obviously we being lawyers and investigators are bound by certain rules. That may not necessarily apply to someone you're sharing a cell with. There's not looking into how you coerce them into a confession. And so sometimes, though they can be real confessions, the reason they may be more effective is that they're sharing a cell, they are bored, or they're scared of their cellmate and they just tell them things. So I'm not commenting on whether that's good or bad, but there are reasons that King used the jailhouse informant.
It's a really interesting constitutional question about whether or not an informant like this becomes an agent of the state, right? I think we texted about this, Alice. There's this case where a documentary crew or a comedian, I can't remember exactly what it was, went into a prison and ended up filming a guy, talking to him, and got a bunch of incriminating stuff out of the guy. And so then they used it in the case against him, and now his lawyer is appealing and saying he was effectively an agent of the state. Even though he's not a police officer, even though he's not a prosecutor, he's an agent of the state because he's talking to this person, getting information. And it's a really sort of interesting legal question about when you become an agent of the state versus just, hey, I'm just another guy in prison.
Yeah, no, this is actually something that we think about and have academic and practical discussions about all the time. But we're trying to explain to you why King probably used a lot of these jailhouse informants. Now, several cases involved the informant John Hall, who we've been talking about, and the information coming from Hall have been questioned. Many of his other cases, well, they're still making their way actually through the appellate courts on similar arguments like 40 years later. So, I mean, King's legacy is still ongoing. This is not something of the past. There are still many of his cases that have kind of been brought back into the limelight because of certain cases being overturned or questioned. Now, some examples include in 2019, Chester Holman III, who was exonerated of a 1991 shooting after it was found that the prosecution team hid evidence and intimidated witnesses. That same year, also in 2019, Orlando Masonette was released after 28 years on death row for similar reasons. And in 2013, Jimmy Dennis was released after 25 years on death row for a murder conviction in which it was found that King suppressed evidence. Now, Dennis actually ultimately took the Alford plea, which is to say that you plead guilty without admitting any wrong to avoid a retrial. Those three instances, they all sound really bad, right? Hiding evidence, intimidating witnesses. I mean, and these people are spending decades on death row. We kind of saw this in the staircase, the Peterson case. Remember where the analyst had lied and then it kind of brought back all of these other cases, reopening up whether there was wrongdoing in their cases. I do have to say, once you have kind of one conviction that has been overturned because of egregious behavior, all of the cases that involve that individual, in this case King, are going to be re-examined. It may not necessarily mean that every case he touched suffered from these defects, but you can imagine why they're serious enough that people would look back at the cases, especially if these people are in death row and awaiting, the ultimate punishment, to see whether there can be an overturning of the conviction based on kind of the newfound evidence. So I'm not surprised that after even just one, no less three, overturning of death row cases or murder convictions, that all of his cases would kind of be re-examined and his legacy would now be tainted. But just because there was wrongdoing in one case doesn't necessarily mean it was the case in every one of his convictions.
And I think that's important. This is never going to be an automatic get out of jail free card. You're prosecuted by this guy, therefore you must be innocent, or therefore he must have committed some sort of sanctionable conduct. Every case has to stand or fall on its own. This is frustrating to some people because what some people will say is, well, how do we know? So we've got all this evidence in other cases that the case was corrupted. And that's great for those cases. In other cases, maybe we don't have the evidence we need to show it was corrupted. But if this is his sort of modus operandi, if this is what he does, why would we think he didn't do it in this case? Just because we don't have the file with the right document in it, or we don't have a witness who can say, yeah, he intimidated me. And it's sort of an ongoing difficulty. And you see this every time something like this happened. Alice mentioned the blood spatter evidence from Michael Peterson. A lot of you know in Massachusetts, they dealt with some pretty serious drug lab controversies where they had people who were lab techs who were also addicted to drugs. You know, in some ways you would think their work was actually probably pretty good because they would test it to see if there was cocaine and they would still have the cocaine for their own use, right? And so that became a problem because then there was a real question about all that testimony this person had given in hundreds of cases about drug weights and drug quantities and drug purity and everything else. And it becomes an issue because how can you trust them in any case? On the other hand, do you want to overturn 1,000 convictions because of this one person? Hard to say. Generally speaking, you're going to look at these cases one at a time. There are people who say that what King was doing was pretty close to criminal. There is a former police officer who has turned whistleblower who said that King would often tell police to change their story because it would sound better to the jury if the facts were different. This goes back to what we were just saying. That way of putting it sounds pretty bad. But once again, the prosecutor is going to go through the testimony of every witness. And many times, witnesses will say contradictory things. They will testify to 3 facts, and then they'll testify to a 4th fact, which makes no sense if the other 3 facts are true. And what you have to do with them is figure out what's going on there. Is the 4th fact true and something's wrong with the first 3? Or were the first 3 true and you just got that wrong and you need to either change the way you're saying that or reconceptualize it or think more about this? Figuring that out might be viewed by some people as you need to fix your story because it's going to sound better in front of the jury if you change that last fact. By other people, it might be, no, we're just trying to get to the truth here, and obviously one of those things isn't true, and we need to figure that out before we put that testimony on in front of a juror. Nevertheless, the things that have surfaced about King are bad enough that the Pennsylvania Conviction Integrity Unit gives special attention to any case that has King's name on it. The current DA in Philadelphia, who is a very controversial figure as well, who has sort of a progressive prosecution approach and has been blamed by a lot of people by increases in crime in Philadelphia. Other people think he's a hero for his approach. And one of the things he's done is he has personally advocated for some of these cases to be overturned where he sees things that King had done and things, this was beyond the line. He's done things like renamed their office, was like the Roger King Prosecution Office or whatever. He took his name off the office, that kind of thing. So those people think, yes, King's a bad guy and the things he did were bad. However, there's another side to this. During his career, King was never disciplined. He was never sanctioned. Ed Randell, who was the actual DA at the time, so district attorneys are the elected official who runs the office. The assistant district attorneys are the ones who actually try the cases. So he was an ADA. It's kind of, if you've seen Law and Order, the old crotchety guy they talk to all the time, he's the DA. But the people who actually try the cases, they're all ADAs. So Ed Randell, he was the DA. He is a former Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, high flyer in the Democratic Party, and he to this day defends King, saying that the allegations of misconduct are overblown, and that given that he tried hundreds of cases a year, and this is an interesting question, his record's actually pretty good. So Alice was saying, you have 3 or 4 cases that go wrong. People are going to start questioning everything you do. How much does it matter if you have 1,000 cases a year? And, over the course of 20 years, you have handled, obviously you're not trying all those cases, but you handle a lot more cases than you try. We talked about his record, and some of you might have thought that 16 death penalty convictions over a career is not that many. In fact, that's an incredible amount. Most DAs, ADAs won't prosecute more than 1 capital murder conviction if they ever do any. And he did 16. But his hands are on many more cases that plead guilty. Some of them will be dismissed. Some of them will be dealt with through other ways. But he's handling tons of cases. And of those tons of cases, you're finding 6 or 7 where something goes wrong. How significant is that? And that's sort of the point that Randall makes. But either way, whatever you think about King, he cast a long shadow over this case and many others. And as we walk through this, you're going to see that. And you're going to see some examples of the things that people criticize King for, changing of testimony, that sort of thing, withholding evidence. You're going to see that in this case. And it's going to be up to you, hopefully with our help, to try and figure out, is it significant or is it something that's overblown?
And part of whether that's significant or not is something that Brett said that I want you guys not to gloss over. I think it is important to note that King wasn't disciplined or sanctioned at the time he was practicing. And it wasn't until decades, nearly half a century later, that he is kind of being scrutinized for his work. And the reason is, obviously, misconduct is misconduct whenever. But there is such thing as kind of putting on a new standard or a new kind of way to grade things onto a different time. What can be perceived as strong arming someone today in an unethical way may have been the modus operandi for everyone back then. And that's not to say that's correct or incorrect, but it's important to note that at least at the time he was practicing, he wasn't seen as some crooked attorney who was being disbarred left and right and being sanctioned by courts around, the country or within his own district, and he was known at the time as being a bad, shady lawyer. It's important to note that this is a relatively new light that's being cast on his legacy. Again, it's not saying whether he was correctly treated at the time, but it is important to note that how he's being viewed right now in terms of his conduct or misconduct does not actually align with his reputation at the time that he was practicing.
And for what it's worth, he's not here to defend himself. He's been dead now, I think, for over a decade. Died not too long after he retired. And it is an interesting question. You could probably do an entire podcast series on him and his cases and the cases he prosecuted. And I will tell you, there are some famous true crime cases that were prosecuted by him. The people don't mention that when they're talking about them because they're sort of celebrated ones where they were solved in sort of really awesome ways. And they found the guy who did it a decade later. And there are people who question those convictions and say, well, I don't know. I know we all celebrate those, but here are all the problems. And Roger King was the one who prosecuted them, and maybe we should think about that. We may do one of those cases later on because there's one in particular that I find very interesting. But in any event, talked a lot about a lot of things not related to the case today. I realize that. But these are all really important. And they're really important when we start to walk through, which we're going to do next week. We start to walk through the criminal case, the prosecution side, the evidence that's presented, and the potential problems with that evidence. I really like this case because it's not easy. This is not a case, I think, where you're going to walk away certain that Ralph is innocent or that he's guilty. And I think you're going to see that as we go through. And it's sort of an example of the messiness of life, and I think the messiness that you often find in these innocent cases. Look forward to going through that stuff with you guys. Look forward to giving our conclusion, which we are going to give you. We're going to, as we always do, we're going to tell you what we think about this case at the end, but we want to give you the opportunity to really analyze some of this stuff before we do that. Well, like I said, I know we spent a lot of time on the sort of optics of this case and the sort of background of this case, but I think it'll be helpful. If you have thoughts right now, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all our social media. Hello to those of you on YouTube, and thank you to all of you who are listening to this episode early and ad-free on Patreon. We love all of you, and we are so happy for your support. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to add before we sign off for today?
No, except I'm excited to really dive into this case, and I hope you guys come back and join us for it.
Yes, I can't wait, and we will do some of that next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
I've had heartburn all day, and it's my own fault because I've eaten a lot of gingerbread cookies today.
Oh, there you go.
I made like a batch of them, you know, like just to have cookies around the house when people come throughout the holidays. But I ended up eating a lot of it. So
See, gingerbread, that's a good thing to eat with like an upset stomach. It's good.
well, that's what I was thinking, but I think it's causing a little.
So
bit
really,
of
it was
heartburn.
medicine, is what you're saying. You were treating yourself.
So if this is for bloopers, everyone, Brett and I have both been throwing up all day.
We have. It's true. It's true.
Well, we'll put that in the intro because everyone, I'm sure, will want to know that.
Yeah.
I'm ready anytime.
Yeah. We had like poopy diapers a couple episodes ago.
so
People got
sad.
upset about that.
Oh, yeah. Wait, that's ridiculous. Okay, whatever.
All month long on Pluto TV, stream the biggest Tyler Perry movies free. Watch your favorites like Medea's Witness Protection and Medea's Big Happy Family. Join Tyler Perry as he goes on a couples retreat with Sharon Leal in Why Did I Get Married? Or Idris Elba and Gabrielle Union in the Tyler Perry directed film Daddy's Little Girls. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows. Available on live and on demand. Download the free Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming now. Pluto TV. Drop in, watch free.